Welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS and a very warm welcome to our weekly review of international relations. It is natural for the human mind to focus on military clashes, issues of war and peace, and when a war in Europe seems to be casting its dark, long shadow all over the globe, analysts have been distracted from other issues which are no less important in the context of their foreign policy and also impinge differently on the national interest of different countries. India is no exception. We have been concentrating so highly on what events in Ukraine that we have forgotten that in our immediate neighborhood, where our national interests are perhaps even more vitally involved, there are developments which have taken place which need to be analyzed. One such area is the Emirate States, the area which sort of is a bridge between India, Arabia and the Middle East, West Asia, the outer concentric circle right after our immediate neighbors. And then when we think in terms of whatever is happening in Ukraine, our mind naturally gravitates towards arms trade, because there has been views expressed that most countries have chosen not to be very harshly critical of Russia's adventure in Ukraine, misadventure as some would say so, because they are dependent on Russia for the arms trade. They are dependent for arms is there. But the same applies to United States. The United States and Russia, both erstwhile superpowers, are major suppliers of arms to the rest of the countries in the world. So we must use this time to look at the nature of the arms trade in the world and how it impacts on global politics. So these are the two major issues which we intend to discuss with you this time. What is the state of relationship of India in its immediate neighborhood like Emirates, Saudi Arabia and this area? What are the developments which have taken place there? And then again take a look at how arms trade impacts on international relations generally. We are not going to focus only on Ukraine, but this is an opportunity to take a good, deep, hard look, a deep dive into this subject. We shall, of course, take up some other issues also which have taken place in the recent weeks and are not unrelated to distractions caused by the conflict in Europe. On 18th February 2022, India signed a very important agreement with United Arab Emirates. This was a comprehensive program for economic cooperation, and this covers a very wide range of activities. It covers exports and imports from Emirate countries to India, and it reduces the tariffs to almost zero. It is a far better extension than the free trade agreement which India has signed with other countries. But before we proceed any further, let's see what are the areas covered. They are from Indian side, this is gems and jewelry, pharmaceutical material, automobile parts, technology, processed foods, agricultural implements, telecom, etc. And from UAE, we have import of very, very delicious dates. But not only this, what is interesting is that this covers not only trade in goods, but services also. And India is very ambitious that in the next 4 or 5 years, we intend to scale up our services to the value of US dollars 15 billion. Now that is a sizable sum. Let's not forget that over 3 million Indians provide services at various levels, from labor and skilled labor to professional to highly sophisticated medicine, engineering, management services, etc. And their numbers are large. They are almost 3 million, and the remittances sent by these Indians providing variety of services in Emirate countries is much more than even the turnover of the trade, and it is projected that the remittances are US dollars over 85 billion, where the trade is all to the value is not insignificant, but 60 billion over a certain number of years. So this is interesting that the UAE is interested. They are short of manpower, short of trained manpower. They are very happy to deal with India, with a country with which they have had a very close and cordial relationship. There are no irritants. And this seems to be a very interesting opportunity for India to consolidate its power projection soft in an area which is strategically sensitive for it. It is not only the UAE, the 7 states in UAE, it is also Saudi Arabia, and it is also Oman and Muscat. So this whole region, the gateway to Arabia, the gateway to West Asia, is opening up fresh opportunities. Now, we should also not forget that in recent past, there have been interesting developments. Countries like UAE have built bridges with Israel, which was a sworn enemy of all the Arabs, all the Islamic states till very, very recently. And it is expected that sooner or later Saudi Arabia would also join this. So Abraham Accords, which had prepared the ground, are underway. So whether it is tourism, whether it is services, whether it is peaceful uses of nuclear energy, new vistas are opening up in this area. Now, this has been neglected because of one more reason. There has been a conflict going on in this region in Yemen, where the Saudi Arabs and UAE have been fighting the rebels, the Houthi rebels, in the southern and the eastern part of this country. Now, Houthis have been assisted by Iranians. Now, Iranians are a Shia state. Saudi Arabs are the leaders of the Sunni Islamic world, and so it is a clash of sectarian Islam at one level. It is a clash of a bit of a revolutionary tinged insurgency against a monarchy and a feudal structure of the state and society in Arabia. And then the Houthis have been in a position to strike at strategically sensitive targets in Saudi Arabia for some time. They have started targeting airports and oil refining establishments in UAE also, and this has brought about a retaliation. So the drones made available to Houthis have been outclassed, in a manner of speaking, by the anti-drone missile systems provided to Saudi Arabia and UAE by Israel and other countries. And in recent past, the Saudis have escalated their attacks on Yemen. So have the UAE. Now, interestingly, this creates a rather interesting problem, because the world has been warned repeatedly that the Yemenis are facing a very severe humanitarian crisis. They are on the verge of a famine, they are suffering malnutrition, there is not enough life-saving drugs there, and Indians cannot, in pursuit of its national interest realpolitically, again keep its mouth shut, keep its lips zipped, and not express an opinion about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. But at the same time, it has an extremely interesting position where it can diplomatically persuade the UAE not to escalate the war against the Yemenis. Houthis can be probably targeted separately. Now, here the risk is that what you target is which you claim as a terrorist group or a group supported by terrorists, and you say that we have got high precision weapons which can target them, but willy-nilly the civilian targets get hit, and there is a great hue and cry about that. This is the kind of thing which we are also witnessing in Ukraine, where Russians claim that they are not targeting civilians, but the pictures which are around and available on the net widely show that civilian apartment residential buildings have been hit, kindergarten schools have been hit, and this is creating a problem. So the area in this area, Emirate, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Oman and Muscat occupy a very strategically sensitive area, and where Indian interests are there, and Indian capacity to influence developments in this area through its diaspora, through its services, through its technological expertise is very, very, very much there. So this is something which we should keep in mind. Now, this has given rise to a very interesting kind of a speculation that there is a Western Quads in embryonic stage. The Quads in the South China Sea has been marginalized, but here the Quad would comprise Israel, USA, India, UAE, and it would be sort of a countervailing factor, either to check Iranian expansion here, or at one stage it was also thought that Turkey might be ambitious to project its power in this region. Now, this is a complex situation which India again has to tread carefully, that India at the moment has put its relationship with Iran at a low key, on a back burner, but it has more or less withdrawn from its participation in the Chabar port development project. But the fact remains that it cannot allow Iran to go and sit on the side of Pakistan and China definitely and cut India out of everything. We also should not forget that Qatar is a country in this region which is playing a very important role in both bringing negotiation, both sides of negotiation to deal with Taliban, and also keep a keen eye on whatever is happening in Iran. So we have, and also earlier the Saudis did not trust the Qataris government very much, but the Amir of Qatar has also conducted his diplomacy pretty far-sightedly and in a sophisticated manner, and some kind of a trust has been restored between the Saudis and the Qataris. So we once again would like to underline that India should not be distracted from developments elsewhere, be it Afghanistan, be it in East Asia, be it in the Indo-Pacific Center. Its own immediate interests seem to be best served by focusing on this area, this geography of Emirate, Saudi Arabia, Oman, because Pakistan has also been trying to cultivate Saudi Arabia, receive financial assistance from it, and through Saudi Arabia try to have a favorable vote in its favor in the Organization of Islamic Countries. Now, all this has all the dimensions which are important for Indian foreign policy in long term. This is an area where India has a presence. This is an area which is proximate. This is an area where there is a diversity of interests from goods and services which coincide with each other. There is one small risk. We did mention the Western Quads, so some analysts feel that India should not again get drawn into a trap where the US-Israeli participation renders India only a facade for showpiece only, and the real politics in this area, diplomacy or strategy, would be conducted between USA, Israel and its partners like Saudi Arabia, influencing UAE, and it would not have an important role to play. It is not as if the Saudis, who are the largest purchasers of American arms, which we shall discuss a little later, would never get out of American embrace. Let's see what has happened in recent past. The UAE has cancelled order of F-35 trainer jets with USA and has decided to buy L-15 trainer jets of all places from China. So this is interesting. So if you have this kind of a switching of diversification of import of arms, is likely that the diplomatic ties which we take for granted might be also under review. Another risk besides the Quads, the Western Quads, is that people think that countries inimical to India, adversarial to India like China, might use this free trade agreement, this comprehensive economic partnership agreement, to their advantage. So India has tried to safeguard its interest by inserting a clause in this which is called the anti-dumping clause. The anti-dumping clause is that India insists that only those goods can be imported at reduced duty rates, reduced customs rates, zero tariff, which at least have had 40% of value addition within United Arab Emirates. And this again, India is planning to have a lot of investment in UAE. Not that UAE needs Indian investment, but when Indian industries set up joint ventures, set up services, these establishments itself would probably allow India to be a partner in adding 40% of this value addition, and this would be a win-win situation for both. So let's see how this unfolds, but this seems to be a very, very positive, constructive development which has remained unseen, overlooked because of the conflict in Europe. It is perhaps time to take a close and a deep look at the international arms trade. How does this export and import of arms, military hardware, impact on international relations? How does it increase the risks of an explosion of a conflict? How does it exacerbate a conflict which is raging? How does it align people on one side or the other side, keeping in mind their dependency on the country where from they import arms? Is there a self-sufficiency among many countries in this area? And let's not forget that ever since the end of the Second World War and ever since the advent of the Cold War, there were two superpowers which more or less monopolized the sophisticated technology for weapons development, not only nuclear weapons, but all kinds of weapons, and also they were the major suppliers to their allies in military alliance systems of the arms and armaments to protect them. Not only to protect their own national interests, but to be a party in a common front, in a united front, to protect the interests of either the United States or the then Soviet Union. they were arrayed on opposite sides at that stage. Much has changed since, but what has not changed is that if you make a list of the top 10 producers and exporters of weapons and 10 correspondingly on the side, 10 countries which import, you find some very interesting facts about international relations. The United States is the top producer and supplier of armaments. It supplies a majority of its arms to its West European allies. Predominantly, the largest customer is Saudi Arabia. Now, it is understandable because Saudi Arabia is the largest producer of oil after America itself, is the very large resources, and the American companies more or less control this oil from exploration to refinement to export in Saudi Arabia. So America's vital national interests are involved with Saudi Arabia, and they are prepared to put up with unconstitutional monarchy, the feudalism there, the medieval mindset of the ruling elite, as long as their economic, geostrategic, fossil fuel related interests are safeguarded here. It also is important to imagine, to understand how Saudi Arabia, it can afford to spend any amount of money on most sophisticated weaponry. So for the ruling elite in Saudi Arabia, the royal family, it is also a status symbol that they can afford, and they have the most sophisticated fighter jets, etc. The other interesting part is the Saudi Arabs have always thought they are surrounded by enemies. The enemies till very recently was Israel, who was against all Arabs, all Muslim countries, protecting itself after several conflicts it has had with the Arabs, and they thought that the Arabs who were being funded to confront Israel by Saudi Arabia. So that was one part. It was not only that only the Jewish state of Israel was against Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabians had all kinds of conflicts with their immediate neighbors also, some of them oil producing. At one stage Iraq and Syria were there, then Kuwait and Qatar are there, and Saudi Arabs have always thought that Qatar has been supporting Islamic terrorists. They have changed their mind a little. There's been a little repairing of the relationship between the two since the Emir of Qatar has followed a very sagacious diplomatic campaign. Now, the interesting part is this, that Saudi Arab is not the only largest purchaser of arms. If we see the list, India ranks right after that. But it is understandable. India may not be an oil producer. India doesn't have a need to flaunt weapons purchases as a status symbol. But the fact remains that India, since independence, has faced challenges on the military front repeatedly. On one front has been the Pakistan, which has constantly thrust a war on India, and throughout the late 50s and early 60s, especially after 1962, India has had to treat China to the north and towards the northeast as a major military challenge. So India, to survive, has had to buy arms and armaments which protect its far-flung land borders and its extensive maritime boundaries also. India's vital national interests, economic, commercial, strategic, also involve the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea. So India has at the same time to spend money on Navy, Air Force and upgrading the weaponry of its armed forces. So there is no comparison between the needs of India, imperative needs of India to import arms and Saudi Arabia, but let's not make these comparisons. But interestingly, what are the other countries which are involved in this import of arms? China, interestingly, is one country which figures in both lists. China is an important producer and exporter of armaments. China is also an important purchaser, customer of armaments. So it buys arms from Russia, but it exports arms also to African countries and to its protectorates, to puppets, to proteges, to Pakistan. A large chunk of it goes to Pakistan. It also goes to North Korea. It also goes to Cambodia. It also now is sold to Myanmar. Now, this is a part. But what surprising is, what surprises us is that the fourth ranking customer of military hardware is Australia. Now that is surprising. Now Australia is a resource-rich country. It has the geographical dimensions of a continent. It has outlook opening out to Antarctic. It looks eastwards to Pacific. It looks upwards to ASEAN and China. It has had a very vibrant trade ties with China till recent stress upset them. But how do we explain, how does Australia find itself threatened to become the number 4 customer in the arms trade all over the world? Why? Does it mean that it is used as a front by the Americans to protect their interests in this region, because they are often criticized for being an outside power trying to intrude in the affairs of the region in Asia? China has repeatedly said so. So isn't Australia being fortified to look after the American interests? So, or are there genuine Australian national interests which justify this kind of an expenditure on arms purchases? Now, there is another aspect. The Australian Fortress Australia development has impacted badly on the Western alliance system. Very recently, when Quads was marginalized and AUKUS was propped up as a substitute, Australia just before that cancelled its deal for a purchase of nuclear submarines with France. France treated it as a great betrayal, and the deal was shifted to United Kingdom. Now, this has two interesting aspects. The Americans has apologized later. It has not made any difference to the French. They still feel very irritated and rankled. They treat this as a betrayal. There is no trust between them and Australia. In any case, they have dropped Australia from the list of their preferred Pacific partners, and they have also rubbed it in by saying that they have a physical presence in the Pacific. They still are present 400,000 French citizens in the French Caledonia. So it's interesting. The French are conveying to Australia that Australia is a more distant presence in Southeast Asia or in the Pacific region, where the French have a physical presence. The French have been using this area for their nuclear tests in past, etc. So actually the French presence and the French cultural influence in Indochina economic relationship continues. It's a francophone area, Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, etc. So interestingly, so there is a division of the world strategically in this part. In sphere of influence of erstwhile colonial powers, United States, China, and non-imperial, non-colonial sphere of influence for India. But then where does Australia fit into this? Does it justify a strategic expenditure to prove the claim that they are not an outside power and very much an inside power? Now, we do not wish to introduce an element of irritants between Indo-Australian bilateral relationship. It is developing very well, but the fact remains, when the Australians deploy nuclear submarines in the Indian Ocean area, in the southern part of the Indian Ocean, it certainly reduces the impact of the presence of Indian Navy in this region. It would then not match the nuclear submarine fleet, and its above the surface fleet also would probably be, to put it bluntly, cut down a little to size. So the Indians have to keep one eye when they are planning their budget for arms purchases, not only what China is doing, not only what Pakistan is being given, not only which itself it has been spending, and we mentioned before that its expenditure on defense budget has reduced a little because our social development expenditure has increased. Also, there has been an adverse impact of COVID on our economy. But in coming years, Indians cannot neglect how others are arming themselves. And when we say others are arming themselves, we very much want Australia to be included there, especially when Australia is given the primacy in the AUKUS to look after the strategic interests of Americans in this region. The Americans have been criticized by the Chinese as an outside power, but can the Australians, predominantly white, predominantly Christian, getting to be racially a little less tolerant in recent years and aligning themselves totally with the strategic interests of Americans and the British, the Anglosphere, even distancing themselves from the European partners so far in the global strategic perspective, is interesting. And how Australia, if in future, in coming days, manages to repair and restore its relationship with China, economic at least immediately, what implications would that have for India, we have to keep in mind. Why we are repeatedly saying this is that the international trade in arms is not only sales and purchase of high value, expensive, lethal equipment. It also involves technology transfers. It also involves alignments which change from the source to the supply. And this is what India must keep in mind. There are Commonwealth ties, there are very good economic ties, but when it comes to the arms trade, you have to watch out. The other interesting thing is that there are some small countries which can ill afford to purchase arms, but then they spend the ill-begotten ruling elite has the ill-begotten wealth. They have to protect that, and they spend on small arms or anti-personnel weapons, and also there may be a limited number of aircraft or helicopters which can be used in anti-insurgency warfare operations against insurgents, dissidents who challenge their rule. We see something of this kind happening in Myanmar next door, where Russia and China both have sold equipment to Myanmar, and this military junta has used them against the forces fighting for restoration of democracy. Now again, the problem is when we go to some other theaters and we find out that the similar challenges exist elsewhere also. There might be a small oil-rich sultanate like Brunei surrounded by instability. In the southern Philippine area, Islamic terrorism is there. There are suspicions that some of the funding comes from Islamic Sultanate of Brunei. Brunei is an enclave surrounded by Malaysia. Malaysia at the moment is not a very large blip on the radar, but it is again where Islamic fundamental Islam has spread itself, and again it is in an area where China is laying claims. So Malaysia is not arming itself like that. Brunei has a lot of resources. We don't know what kind of arms are available to Malaysia and Brunei and this fringe, and how there can be a resistance or a pushback if there is aggression by a larger neighbor or by a group which is a terrorist group which wants to destabilize. So there are arms of different kind. So if in a country is a regional power, is a major power, the kind of weapons you think in terms of our fighter jets, you think in terms of submarines, you think in terms of warships, you think in terms of missiles, surface to air, air to air. But when you are talking of a small country in the weapons trade, it might be automatic rifles, it might be grenades, it might be anti-personnel mine, and also it might be minesweepers to protect yourself against improvised explosive devices, etc. Now all this is of relevance in the continent of Africa, where we have repeated coups, army takeovers, people familiar with the only form of coercion which they are used to is weaponry and armament, and also this supply is repeated violation of human rights and erosion of democracy. Two specific cases we might mention in this case. We mentioned Saudi Arabia, and we have mentioned in a different context a country called Yemen. Now recently the attacks of Saudi Arabs and UAE against Yemen have increased, and their deployment of anti-missile batteries has shot down the unmanned drones which had so far made it possible for the Houthi rebels to target oil installations in Saudi Arabia or civilian targets like airports in Abu Dhabi. These drones were being made available to them by Iranians. But now Iranians themselves are besieged at the moment, and the supporters of Saudis and UAE have made available to them anti-missile arsenal, which has changed the symmetry of power in this area. Now again, who are these other suppliers? If we go down the list, we find that Turkey is also a recent emergent in the suppliers of the weapons. We also say that Israelis are also there. So if Israelis and UAE relationship has improved, if Turkey is making its peace temporarily with Saudi Arabs and the other Arabs, and Turkey is also producing missiles and drones, you have a very interesting situation that while countries like India are concentrating on the large producers and large suppliers, USA, Russia, China, for our point of view, Israel, this accounts for almost 80% of our supplies. We are receiving USA, Russia, France, Israel account for almost 80% of what we are getting in our defense arsenal. But for the other countries, even the smaller producers are important. We did mention that the UAE has cancelled a deal with Americans about the F-35 trainer jet aircraft, opting for the Chinese L-15 is a very odd kind of a shift in alliances. So if we keep that in mind, we will get a better picture of what is happening around us. A related issue is this, that most countries now of India's size and magnitude try to be self-reliant. They not only try to diversify their sources of weapons supply, they also try to acquire as soon as possible self-sufficiency in certain vital equipment which is there. In India's case, we have this self-sufficiency, if not to launch attack globally, but to protect our interests in terms of missiles, in terms of a nuclear deterrent, avoiding the first strike, but to project unacceptable damage on a person who dares to do this, to avoid nuclear blackmail. But we have a long way to go, and always it is a guns and butter dilemma. I mean, the amount of resources which a country has is limited, especially like India, and if you spend it on self-sufficiency in weapons development, it becomes very expensive, it becomes a very long-term project, and there is a cost to be paid in terms of social justice, equity, etc. But at the same time, there are no choices. The integrity and independence of a country are inviolable, and what the case of Ukraine shows repeatedly is that no country can take it for granted that in the present state of international system, any multilateral organization or any pre-existing alliance or assurance, be it NATO, be it EU, be it United Nations, is enough to take it for granted that your territorial boundaries will remain inviolate if a more powerful neighbor chooses to launch an attack on you. So there has to be preparedness for this. We cannot say that we love peace, we promote peace, but we have to maintain the national interest, and our own national interest preservation and protection is directly related to the hard power we can command at any given time. All very nice about soft power, but soft power only complements the hard power which a country can project and use. Just before war exploded in Ukraine and Europe was disturbed, Iran had come very close to a revival of the agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan for Action for its nuclear program. In 2015, President Obama had succeeded in bringing Iran to a compromise of sort, that it would agree not to enrich its nuclear fuel to the level where it can be used for nuclear weapons, but it should not inhibit its deployment for peaceful purposes for development. Iran had agreed, and Iran was expecting that economic sanctions would soon be withdrawn and there would be a normalcy restored both for its nuclear program as well as in its relationship with America. But this was not to be. When President Trump was elected, he reneged on this program. He went back on a sovereign treaty agreement, reducing America's credibility in international relations. But it did not matter for ex-President Trump. He also imposed fresh sanctions on Iran and forced Iran to follow a course of action which was an action of defiance of sanctions imposed on it by a foreign power. It said that no foreign power can impose sanctions on a sovereign country which is following a program to protect its own integrity, independence, and ensure its economic development. So it slowly started enriching its uranium, and it has come up from a level of 4% agreed upon in 2015 agreement to almost 20% today. Now, the time taken for enrichment from 4% to 20% is long, but most experts agree that from 20% to 80-90% weapons grade enrichment is not so difficult. There is another aspect of this program which should be mentioned. The Israelis have repeatedly taken pride in making boastful statements that they will not let Iran go ahead with its nuclear program. Its secret service has launched attacks which have resulted in assassinations of top-notch Iranian nuclear scientists. There has been sabotage in centrifugal plants part of this nuclear program in Iran. There are too many coincidences, and Iran at one stage was also making a statement that it might launch a preemptive strike in self-defense to destroy Iran's nuclear installations. Iran has had to shift them, move them underground. So there is this interference, this blatant violation of a sovereign country's territorial integrity by another country which thinks that it can afford to do this and get away with this. So the Iranians have been more pugnacious, more combative because of this also. Now, just before this had happened, when Biden took over power, he could not retreat all at once and say that we are withdrawing all the sanctions. But Iran was insisting that because the additional sanctions were imposed on Iran by President Trump when he reneged from this agreement, Joint Comprehensive Program for Action, he said that if the Americans make the first move and withdraw these additional sanctions, Iran would reciprocate, and then Iran would consider slowing down the program, and then the Americans could perhaps undertake some more confidence building measures. Now all these important talks had again begun in Vienna. Now these talks, unfortunately, are talks involving 6 parties. There is Russia, there is China, there is United Kingdom, there is France, there is Germany, and then we have Iran there. Now, and when the breakthrough seemed imminent, Israelis were again trying to throw a spanner in the works by saying that this is a weak agreement, it does not bind Iran to something, Iran should be bound more strictly, ironclad guarantee should be there, so their nuclear program should not be weaponized. Iranians felt the same way. They thought that a beginning would be made, but what would stop if another president is elected like Trump, or Trump is re-elected and reneges this again? So what kind of ironclad guarantees can Iran have from this agreement? Now, unfortunately, the ironclad guarantees in this case can only be given by people who are not directly involved in the conflict. So, in this case, France or Germany or UK or Russia or China could have done that. But as long as Russia and America are at loggerheads after Ukraine, as long as China seems to be much closer to Iran than, it is closer to Iran today, but is also sharing a strategic perspective with Russia in Ukraine. So can one imagine that there can be any breakthrough or progress in the talks in Vienna which were taking place? Would this be given the priority? And if this is not given the priority, it would be a very, very tragic loss of the momentum which had been built so far. So Iran goes back to its program. The Americans and the Russians are not in a position to share a same dais forum and talk about it. Britain and France and China again are embroiled in whatever is happening in the war in Europe. Sad thing. So this is what we would like you to keep in mind, that what happens is that there are certain distractions which are so unfortunate that the progress made over years by both sides is lost in a blink. This seems to be happening. We hope it doesn't result in this. In the talks about the nuclear program of Iran, which are taking place in Vienna, because now the hectic diplomacy which preceded the explosion in Ukraine and the diplomacy which would inevitably take place after a semblance of peace returns in Ukraine, or the problem of refugees getting out, exodus from Ukraine to other European countries, all this will take primacy for Europeans, for Americans, also for Russians and Chinese, and Iranians would again be forgotten. This is all we have for you this week, but there are some very important points to be underlined and re-emphasized. Let's talk about, first of all, India's primacy of interests, economic and strategic, in its immediate neighborhood, in Emirate countries, in Saudi Arabia, and the area which is proximate, Qatar, Oman, Muscat, gateway to West Asia. I think we should not neglect this at all and try to reinforce our existing relationship, economic, commercial, trade and services, transfer of technology, and expand the trade so there is a shared interest in whatever is happening in strategic affairs. Fortunately, India and Israel have improved their ties dramatically in recent past, so there is no obvious clash of interest. The only place where we think we should take caution is not let the US drive Indian diplomacy in this region. When we come to the arms trade, the one thing which has to be kept in mind constantly is that once you undertake an arms import from a country, the tendency is that you tend to not only share their worldview, you are tied to them for repairs, for spare parts, and once you have you train your pilots to fly Russian planes, you train your sailors to go into nuclear submarines supplied by Russia, you have an aircraft carrier from that source, then it sort of integrates your armed forces thinking, strategic thinking, in line with what you have bought. India has wisely tried to diversify it, but it still is a long way to go. As we noted, 49% of our arms import is from Russia. We also have to keep a very keen eye on how others are arming themselves. Even a country like Australia, far distant, but it can, after the nuclear submarines acquired from UK, project and deploy them in Indian Ocean, and it becomes sort of a challenge to what the Indian naval power projections have been made for the past few decades in this area. Massive investment is involved for. Are we so closely allied to Australia that we can rethink our budgetary allocations for our Navy in coming years? Can we take it for granted that Australia is not actually a power which is representing a country representing external powers like UK and the Americans in this region? The objections which the Chinese had for America can also be leveled, targeted at Australia. India and Australia have very cordial relationship, very close relationship, but there is distance, and it is not necessary that the strategic perspective is shared all the time, always. Then we, at the moment, have forgotten in this country about Iran, thanks to our proximity and our tendency to be guided by Americans about Iran. I think what is happening to the sort of blocked talks about Iran's nuclear programs in Vienna and the distraction caused by the conflict in Ukraine is unfortunate, because I think the sooner Iranians are readmitted to the Committee of Nations and economic sanctions against them are withdrawn, there would be a general reduction of tensions, and the chances of Iranians getting out of the stranglehold, tight embrace of China or proximity with Pakistan would not be there, and this would be all said and done in Indian interest. Think about these things carefully, think about what has been happening, and then we'll discuss many things which have been overlooked, remained unseen because of the hectic events, violent events of the past few weeks. Till we meet again next time, thank you and goodbye.